This video is brought to you by Nebula. As Trump takes office, one of the big items on his agenda is China. Trump has promised eye-watering tariffs on Chinese goods to protect American industry, reduce the US trade deficit, and put yet more pressure on China's shaky economy. However, contrary to popular wisdom, some people think Trump's trade war might actually be good for the Chinese economy, insofar as it'll force the CCP to address its macroeconomic bias towards exports, which is arguably the root cause of China's various economic crises. So in this video, we're going to take yet another look at China's economy and its shortcomings, how it'll be affected by the coming trade war, and why at least some people think it might help. Who's the worst politician right now? Hear our thoughts and argue with us on our podcast, The World Leader Leaderboard. Find it over on the TLDR Podcast YouTube channel or in your favourite podcast app. So, as we've argued in previous videos, the root cause of China's economic crisis is plausibly the fact that consumption accounts for a disproportionately small share of its overall GDP. Essentially, GDP is often defined as the sum of four things: government spending, business investment, household consumption, and the difference between exports and imports. Household consumption makes up a disproportionately small fraction of Chinese GDP, something like 40%. In practice, this means that your average Chinese person doesn't really buy or consume that much stuff, and the Chinese economy is instead mostly driven by exports to foreigners. Because of this, Chinese workers produce more stuff than they consume, creating a surplus of goods that China then exports to the rest of the world, hence why China runs a trade surplus. Anyway, many economists think that the root cause of China's multifaceted economic crisis is this weak domestic demand. The deflationary crisis, for example, is in part because Chinese consumers just don't have enough disposable income. The property crisis has been partly caused by the fact that Chinese savings, which are particularly high because rich people and businesses can underpay their workers, can't find productive investments because there's no domestic demand, and getting money out of China can be difficult. So they have to stash it all in non-productive investments like property. Similarly, China's local governments have built up so much debt because they invest in these big infrastructure projects like high-speed rail or massive bridges, but Chinese consumers just aren't economically active enough to actually make productive use of these investments, which means they don't produce higher tax receipts to pay off the debts. Western economists at the IMF and elsewhere have therefore suggested that the CCP rebalance its economy towards consumption, presumably via some sort of stimulus to Chinese households and consumers. While the CCP have implemented a handful of stimulus packages over the past few months, they haven't been sufficient, and the Chinese economy is still very unbalanced, as evidenced by the record-breaking $1 trillion trade surplus China ran in 2024. Anyway, quite a lot of this surplus is absorbed by the US, which imports lots of Chinese stuff and runs a pretty massive trade deficit. In other words, imports more stuff than it exports. A lot of attention is paid to America's bilateral trade deficit with China. The US imported about $270 billion more from China than it exported to China in 2024, for instance. But in general, it's not a good idea to pay too much attention to bilateral trade balances, because they don't account for trade that's rerouted through some third country like Mexico, which is why overall trade balances are generally more informative. Anyway, either way, the point we're making is that China exports more than it imports, and quite a lot of this surplus is, directly or indirectly, absorbed by the US. Trump doesn't like this, because he thinks that Chinese imports are undercutting American manufacturers and contributing to America's deindustrialization. This is why Trump is so keen on tariffs. He thinks they'll make it harder for China to export to the US, allowing American companies to thrive without unfair Chinese competition. Anyway, while a trade war will definitely cause some short-term turbulence for China, at least some people think it could actually be good for the Chinese economy in the long term. The argument here is that if the tariffs make it harder for China to export its surplus to the US, Chinese producers will be sitting on a whole load of stuff with no one to buy it, and this will force the CCP to boost domestic demand to create new buyers for these goods, accelerating the rebalancing that the IMF and others have been pushing for. In October, for instance, one of Asia's largest asset managers told Bloomberg that a trade war isn't necessarily a bad thing for China for the long term, And in November, Goldman Sachs published an investor's note arguing that, quote, if Chinese goods face higher US tariffs next year, this would accentuate the shift towards domestic demand. So, is this plausible? Well, it all depends on what you think the root cause of the global trade imbalance is. If you think the US is the root cause because American consumers love taking out lots of debt to consume imports, which is fueling the demand for Chinese goods, then you might be convinced. After all, tariffs make it harder for these American consumers to spend their cash on imports, which might reduce the American trade deficit. This will mean less demand for Chinese goods, which can instead be bought by Chinese consumers, reducing the overall trade imbalance. This would be good for Chinese consumers, who'd get more money and a temporary flood of cheap Chinese goods, as Chinese producers rush to redirect their surplus, but also good for global geopolitical stability, given it's become pretty clear that one of the root causes of tension between China and the US is the unbalanced trading relationship. Conversely, however, if you think the fundamental issue is that the CCP are suppressing the wages of ordinary Chinese workers to force a trade surplus for geopolitical ends, and that as long as Chinese households have insufficient purchasing power, nothing's going to change, then you'll be less convinced. As long as Chinese households don't have that much purchasing power, China's economy will remain unbalanced, even if America's trade deficit shrinks. China might just find new markets for its trade surplus, like the growing middle classes in Southeast Asia, or redirect its surplus into the American market via third countries like Mexico, which already seems to be happening. But even if Chinese producers can't find new markets, this doesn't necessarily mean an increase in consumption. It could just cause a temporary economic slowdown, only for exports to rise again once international demand picks up. This is sort of what happened after 2008. While the subsequent collapse in foreign demand caused China's trade surplus to fall temporarily, it quickly returned to growth and has grown relatively consistently since. This problem could be made even more acute if the turbulence induced by Trump's trade war undermines Chinese consumer confidence, which will dampen domestic demand even further. All in all, however you think the coming trade war is going to play out, the main takeaway here is that the global trading system is deeply unbalanced and becoming a real source of geopolitical tension. And while it's hard to imagine at the moment, a sustainable solution will probably require China and the US to both agree to some new monetary order. Like a lot of things, this whole situation is very much in a state of flux. With us entering a new year and Trump re-entering the White House, well, the world has felt more stable, hasn't it? Every day we're faced with weird headlines, from Trump's attempts to take over Canada and Elon's wild ride in Europe, or even Trump trying to swap New Jersey for a shiny Charizard on the playground. Okay, that last one might not be real, but we do dive into the chaotic world of US politics in our series WTF USA. That's our series where we explain everything that's happened across the pond in the land of the free. Because while the election might be over, with Trump in the Oval Office, the number of WTF moments only looks likely to increase. Unlike some of our other more serious videos, the tone of WTF USA is more light-hearted, and takes something of an irreverent look at what's going on. If you're interested, WTF can be found exclusively on Nebula. Now, if you didn't know, Nebula is an independent, creator-owned streaming platform that specializes in thoughtful content. Over there, you can find creators like Wendover Productions, Real Life Law, and Legal Eagle, with many of them releasing their very own original series on the platform. We're super proud of WTF USA, and we hope that with your support, we'll be able to make other interesting, weird, and entertaining series with Nebula in the future. So signing up genuinely helps TLDR to grow and expand. You can also watch every normal TLDR video on Nebula ad-free, and in some instances before they land on YouTube. If you're not a member already, click our link in the description to get 40% off. We really hope you check out the series, and as always, thanks for your support.